Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Today in our lecture we will discuss what we continued in the last two lectures, our discussion about the development of stylistics with regard to the influences that it has upon it from Russian formalism, new criticism, and the other developments in literary criticism. As we in the last lesson also looked at the origin, development, and the importance of Russian formalism for the sake of understanding of what it has given to stylistics, as stylistics now emerges as a medium, as a mode, which can be implied as a mode of criticism that can understand language, that can understand specifically the language of literature. In the last two lectures, we looked at the origin of Russian formalism, that it was a movement that started from Russia in the 1920s onwards, and it lasted for about 20 years, for it provided literary understanding of the text from the perspective of a linguist. Certain Russian formalist theorists like Roman Jakobson and John Makarowski, they propose certain methods and techniques of the understanding of literary language that identifies literary language as a unique language. There were a number of concepts of the school of thought that is known as Russian formalism, which introduced the significance of linguistic analysis for the study of literature, as the linguistic understanding and the development of linguistic theories in the 20th century has proved very vital and also fruitful for the study of literature, which earlier had been ignored. And literary criticism in the past decades had been pursuing the study of literature from the point of view of the author. What author wants to imply through the text, what the author has been influenced with, which has been reflected in the text. Now, with the advent of the formalism, a new wave of criticism and understanding is about to take shape. In the early 20th century, formalists like John Makarowski, Victor Shklovsky, Roman Jakobson, they all were united on a single point, that text is distinctive, specifically literary text is distinctive because of its literariness, because of the different language that it makes use of. Now let us look at with great detail at the concepts that in the last lecture we looked at a glance, and one of those concepts that formalism proposes for the study of literature is literariness of the language. And stylistic also recognizes this fact, this important discovery of the formalists, that literary texts are to be handled differently because the literary language is very different from the ordinary language. And if literary language is to be distinguished on the basis of its literariness, on the basis of its distinctive, elevated language, then there must be certain components and symbols or images employed by the writer which add to the meaning of a text. So according to the formalists, poetic language and ordinary language, the language of everyday use, must be separated, must be looked at from two different perspectives. The language of literature is distinguished from the language of everyday use due to its importance, due to its literariness. And formalists position themselves in Aristotelian tradition, in which poetic language must appear strange and wonderful. Now this is surprising, that though formalism is a modern development, the development of the 20th century, which wants to set a different mode of practice of the literary text's understanding, which should not be governed by the traditional methods of approaching the text from the perspective of the social, biographical leanings and influences of the author. Rather, it approaches text as autonomous. Now, they are also impressed by the Aristotelian tradition of the definition of style. Aristotle has defined style of literature to be the distinctive mark which elevates the expression and which is also motivated by certain aesthetic devices. So in Aristotelian tradition, formalist theorists and critics approach poetic language as strange, deviant, wonderful, and unusual. Now, when the formalists recognize poetic language or literary language to be strange, unusual, and wonderful, they mean to refer to the fact that the language of literature is ambiguous, that the language of literature is complicated. And it is owing to this complication of the literary language that a more rigorous and scientific way of observing each and every word, the whole composition of the language of literature, must be put into practice. So that is why they want to go a step ahead from the step or the developments of the literary critics. They want to embark upon a new study, new method of analysis of literary texts that does not ignore any details that occur in the text as curiosities of language, ambiguities, and strangeness of language. And that they do with the same old classical tradition that was proposed by Aristotle as well. Now, one thing that we have started with, the concept of literariness. Now, in order to understand further what is meant by literariness, what literariness is that the formalists hold supreme and higher in the literary analysis. Now, this literariness owes its existence to many things, and one such things that can be specified to be what makes a language literary language is the concept of defamiliarization. That is another key component or feature of formalist study of the literary texts. When they firstly recognize a literary text possessing literariness that distinguishes it from the ordinary language, they then further pinpoint one mode which is referred to as defamiliarization. The concept of defamiliarization refers to making things appear strange, as the very word defamiliarization connotes that the word familiar has been associated with strangeness, that something familiar would be made to appear strange, unusual, and unbelievable. Now, when language is artfully employed to make something familiar and known seem unfamiliar and unknown, that process is referred to as defamiliarization. And defamiliarization is a technique that a writer or a poet employs for the sake of creating the language of the text and making it deviant, different, unusual, and striking for the reader. So, one thing that all forms of art share is this concept of defamiliarization. And Victor Shklovsky, in his book Art as Technique, has talked about the fact that the techniques employed in the literary expressions or artistic expressions must make objects unfamiliar, and they must make the process of the understanding of the text difficult. They must prolong it. Now that we have distinguished the purpose of literary writings from ordinary writings as aesthetic one and not to be the primary focus of the ordinary language, that is communication only, then in literary texts the technique of defamiliarization prolongs the process of the aesthetic pleasure that a reader gains. For example, defamiliarization can be understood by our analysis of any symbol, metaphor, or literary device that we begin to appreciate after our reading and analysis of the text. For example, think about John Donne's poem Valediction Forbidding Morning and the celebrated conceit of a compass used for the two lovers. Now, it is defamiliarization. How? That we find how unliterary or how strange an object of a compass a geometrical instrument, has been employed instead of something that is referred to as romantic, like a stream or birds or flowers or fragrance. So instead that Donne uses something known and usual with which the reader is familiar, he uses an unfamiliar and even so strange an object, a compass, to refer to the unity of the two lovers through the joining of the legs of the compass, as they are single, they are united, and without one the other cannot perform, the other cannot move or complete the circle. Now this can be taken as the example of defamiliarization. It is defamiliarization of what the reader is comfortable with, what the reader is familiar with. Because according to Shklovsky, art defamiliarizes anything that the audience or the readers are familiar with. You are familiar with the idea of the unity of the lovers, or the way the romantic poetry or the Elizabethan sonnets talk about the idea of love. But how Donne's employing the analogy or the conceit of a compass reveal that idea in a very different or new way makes us really wonder that how come a compass be a pertinent and suitable symbol to refer to such a romantic idea of the lovers' unity. So that idea that art defamiliarizes things that we have become habitual or automatic justifies the significance of defamiliarization. We would have gotten bored with writers repeating the same themes in the same ways, using the same symbols, images, and metaphors. How the emergence, for example, of the metaphysical poets changed the perception of the readers. How the simple images which were preferred in the poetry of the Elizabethan poets or the sonnet composers has been violated by the metaphysical poets like Donne. And then how the modern poets experiment with the form, how they defamiliarize the form, the technique of writing, as well as the images and objects and symbols that they employ in writing. They are baffling, they are confusing, they are perplexing for the reader. So we agree with Shklovsky's point that the basic purpose of art is to defamiliarize the objects so that the receiver or the perceiver gets a feeling that he or she has never encountered it before. That is why it would keep the interest of the audience or the reader alive, and they would be interested to read and gain more pleasure out of their reading and appreciation of the text. Another key concept that formalists discovered and proposed, and which had a great impact in the study of stylistics and in the discipline of stylistics, is the concept of foregrounding. Foregrounding refers to the concept of giving importance to something, giving prominence to some object, idea in the literary writing. The concept of foregrounding can be understood by the very word that it encompasses within it, the word foreground. We recognize foreground as something that is set against a background. So it means that literary writings too operate like a painting. Just the way on a canvas you encounter a painting that has a background and a foreground too. You identify any object that your eye picks from among many objects painted on the canvas as foregrounded feature. For example, if you are viewing a painting or a scenery in which you see a multiple variety of objects displayed by the painter in the natural setting, you might pick up maybe, for example, a flower or a hut to be distinctive and distinguished from among the rest of the objects painted on the painting. Then, when you focus your attention on that hut or flower, all the rest of the objects in the painting recede into the background. Now, something, because of its shape, its color, its size or its texture has appealed you in a painting, and other multiple objects have receded to the background. Same happens with literary writings. When you look at literary writing as an artistic expression, as a painting, you recognize that when you read a poem, certain distinctive details, or maybe a single distinctive detail, might appeal you, and the rest of the details that the writer has joined would recede to the background. So this is the act of foregrounding, that a writer, unlike the painter who would paint with the colors and paints and brushes, the writer would paint with words, a picture which the reader would see, which the reader would imagine. And in that picture that is painted with the help of words, there would be certain things which would be forming the background of the writing, and there would be certain features which would become distinctive and prominent and become the foreground. Now, when certain features from among many features of language are chosen by the writer to be the foreground, to be the prominent features, then they must carry something significant, like they would be either symbols or literary devices, or even the unusual deviant way of using language can become the foreground too. The writer in foregrounding gives prominence to something, and that is done in an artful use of language. Here, the language is used in a strange, unfamiliar, unusual and artistic a way that creates either an image or a symbol or a metaphor which is striking and becomes the foreground. Take the same example that we have been discussing for today's discussion of Donne's Valediction Forbidding Mourning, in which he has made use of the conceit of a compass. How, after reading the poem, we are bent upon understanding what does the compass stand for, what does this analogy has to add to the meaning of the poem as a love poem, or as a sort of tribute to love and the beloved. We recognize this feature, the conceit of the compass, as the foregrounded feature that comes to stand out from among rest of the features employed in the text, which recede into the background. Now, this feature of foregrounding brings certain features or elements of the text to the forefront, and readers focus their attention on the foregrounded features. In this way, it means that literary texts contain many elements, and from among those elements which have been utilized by the author to communicate a message or to give a sensation or a feeling, a few features, certain features would dominate, and those dominant features would be the foregrounded realities or the foregrounded features of the literary writing. Another key concept that the formalists proposed for the study of literary writing is referred to as automatization. As the very word automatization seems to refer to the word automatic, it is to instill the idea or a feeling in the critic or the reader's mind that the text or literary writing too, because of its ordinariness, because of its repeated use, may become automatic, may become ordinary. Now, automatization is the automatic or inevitable process by which an artistic object becomes habitual, banal, and loses its power as an artistic object. For instance, this concept of automatization serves to be at the very other end of defamiliarization. Defamiliarization was making known things strange, and automatization is to present the things the way we know them, the way we see them, the way we perceive them as they are, without changing their expression, without changing their representation. So automatization is the usual, automatic, ordinary, and you can say more practiced and regular way of expressing something. So In literature, both the concepts, defamiliarization, that is changing the reader's perception and feelings by presenting something known in a way that they may appear to have never encountered in life or in literary writings. It instills the feeling in the reader that from among the rest of the writing or the background of the language, there are certain automatic features, certain regular features, which are also necessary for the sake of making something appear prominent. So, automatization familiarizes the reader with the patterns. For example, the idea that the poetic language usually distorts the syntax. The order of the words in a statement is replaced, changed, so that the sound or expression of the poem, its utterance, sounds balanced and full of rhythm and rhyme. Now, it has become quite known to the readers that poetry automatizes this event of syntactical deviation. For example, if we change the syntax order of the words in a sentence, that is poetic sentence, it would be defamiliarization from the point of view of language, because familiar way of expression in language is different and poetry is defamiliarizing it. For example, look at that statement of Robert Frost from the Mending Wall that says, "Something there is that doesn't love a wall." Now, when we have used this expression, when the poet has used this expression, instead of saying, "There is something that doesn't love a wall," he says, "Something there is that doesn't love a wall." In this way, he has changed, he has disrupted the order of syntax. We are familiar with the simple pattern where there should be something that should not be there in the beginning. But defamiliarizing it, he distorts the syntactical order. But since distortion of the syntax has become common practice in the language of poets or in poetic language, we have become familiar of this practice. Now the reader is not unaware of the fact that poets most of the time experiment with the syntax and they distort it. Now, this practice of syntactical disorder has become an automatized activity, an automatized technique. So that is how we study automatization, because it is a process by which the artistic object, for example poetry or the expression of poetry, would become habitual, would become ordinary, understandable and simple for the reader. So side by side, both the concepts defamiliarization and automatization exist in the literary expression. Defamiliarization makes simple and ordinary things seem strange through the use of unusual artistic writing or language, whereas automatization, through the practice of habitual writing or balanced and rhythmic writing, makes things appear familiar and known. So these key concepts of formalism, like automatization, foregrounding, defamiliarization and literariness, these are the key features which we can term as the achievement, discovery or the major contribution of the formalist critics. Formalist critics highlighted the sensitive role of language in the literary works. Hence, they highlighted the significance of the literary analysis, which should make use of a very focused and scientific analysis, where the language of literature is literary language and the writers enhance its literariness through defamiliarization and by foregrounding some features, and also by automatization. So these concepts of automatization, defamiliarization, foregrounding and literariness, they function as the key components of the formalist school. Now these are the concepts on which stylistic analysis also bases its understanding and its analysis. Because since the discovery of these terms has highlighted the significance of poetic language or the literary language, the critics who were earlier ignoring the specialized vocabulary and the artistic expression employed in the poetry and literary writings are now given the task to observe these features minutely and study its significance in terms of its meanings that are inherent in these words and techniques. Let us now look at what formalism has contributed to the field of prose or fiction. As earlier, our study concerned mostly with literature and specifically with poetry. Now, apart from poetry, which defamiliarizes, which adds to literariness, which even makes use of automatization, defamiliarization as well, what do the formalist theorists have to contribute to the study of fiction and prose? Formalists also had a breakthrough discovery for the analysis and study of prose and fiction. We distinguish prose and fiction to be such modes of expression or literary expression in which there is a dependence on a story. The writer depends upon a storyline or which he narrates or presents to the reader. Now, in formalism, there are two parts or the two concepts which are dealt with great detail and with great scrupulous attention. They say that the story is referred to as fabula, that you mostly are familiar with the word fable, also used synonymously for the word story. Now, Russian formalists use the term fabula for the term story, and for the word plot, they have devised the term shuzhe. Now, these are Russian terms. According to the Russian formalists, the story is almost the same, or it has the same order or chronological sequence or the way the things happened. But plot, which is the way a story is presented, is unique and different to every story. Formalists have made influential contribution to the theory of prose and also to the theory of fiction, stories and novels. With respect to this genre, the central distinction that the formalists have made is that between story, that is the enumeration of the facts or the chronological order of the events, and plot. According to formalists, shuzhe is plot and fabula is story. And story is the chronological enumeration of facts and sequence of events in the story. And the author is said to transform the raw material of a story or the events into a literary plot, that is the shuzhe, with the use of a variety of devices that violate the order, sequence, the way the things happened. And in this way, they defamiliarize, they deform the expression, hence they defamiliarize it. Now, the effect is to foreground the narrative medium rather than the story itself. Now, the part of the charm in fiction and novel or drama or even prose lies in the fact how the story is narrated. What details are exposed earlier? Are they revealed in the same order, the way things happened, or has the chronological order been disturbed? Now, to understand this distinction of fabula and story, we'll look at both the concepts separately. The concept of fabula, that is story, and the concept of shuzhe, that is the plot. Now, fabula is the fable, the story. Fabula designates the raw material with which the narrative is made. It is what the narrative comprises of, the story, the events, the sequence. Then the story is considered to have happened or existed in the chronological series or events which will be recounted in order in which they took place. So mostly we narrate a story in the same way, the way things happened. Happenings which occurred earlier are mentioned earlier, and then reaching to its conclusion the way it happened later. Now that is the story which exists in terms of the beginning, middle and end. Every story has got its beginning, its initial delineation and its exposition, and then it reaches to its climax with the respect to certain details of the story, and then after the climax there is denouement or the resolution and the ending. Now this is the sequence of the way things happened. But apart from this segment, that is the story or the way things or events happened, there is another part that is referred to as the plot, the structure or the concept by formalism as referred to as chose. Fabula will be organized into a chose or plot. Now it is the writer who chooses which details of the story to expose earlier, which details of the story which may have happened earlier but are to be held and later exposed or revealed to the reader. Now this order of arranging the events, either the writer may choose to arrange and present the events in the chronological order, the way things happened, or he may choose to disrupt that order. For example, observe how the writers through the flashback techniques might present to you an idea that a character, for example, observe the story of Death of a Salesman, Arthur Miller's play. In Arthur Miller's play, Death of a Salesman, we meet the protagonist, Willy Loman, when he is above 60. But what has happened in his life before he reached the age of 60 has been revealed later in the story. The author doesn't start the story from young Willy Loman. He starts the story with the old Willy Loman, and then from present he moves, shifts back to the past through the flashback technique, and on and off within the story of the play, the protagonist Willy Loman comes back to the present and even fancies the future. Now this is the plot. The story is the same, that Willy Loman, a young enthusiastic man who started his life with a lot of promise, began to feel that he is a loser, and then his children also did not reward him what he had expected from him, the hopes that he had with him, and then the children's indifference towards him and Willy Loman's inability to understand his failure in life, and then consequently his death. Now this is the story, but the story is not arranged in the same order the way things happen. The story is arranged in an order that the chose or the plot of the narration designates, that we meet the author at present time, and then the beginning of his life is narrated through the flashback. Now in the play, the flashback technique appears to be the most significant feature of this play as a defamiliarizing effect, because the readers are not familiar with such happenings and sequences of the story, that how the writer would move back and forth in time, and how through the device of the memory of the protagonist, something that has happened earlier would be recapitulated. Now that sequence, that is the flashback technique or the disruption of the order of the events, the way they happened, is narrated in the terms that it would signify that the formalist critics would focus on this technique when they would observe a fiction, a play or a novel. Now that the poetic language has been looked at as something that is either automatization, defamiliarization or literariness for the field of fiction and prose studies, the formalists observed these two major distinctive features of fiction and prose in the form of plot and story, in the form of chose and the fabula. These are the two concepts, the fabula and chose, which reveal that formalists also diverted their attention to the study of prose and fiction. They were not only concerned with the study of poetry, though initially they began their exercise of the analysis of literary works from poetry, and it is through their understanding and study of the poetry that they gave the concept of literariness, automatization, defamiliarization, and foregrounding too. But when it comes to literature, its understanding, they did not even ignore the study of fiction and prose. And for the sake of the analysis in fiction and prose, they distilled the idea of plot as chose, which is distinctive of the story. Story might be the same, but plot might be what the writer can experiment with. So this technique or method of narration is what becomes significant for the study of the analysis of a work from the point of view of a formalist analyst. And this is what stylistics takes from formalism, that they highlighted that the study of prose and fiction must be done from the perspective that there are messages inherent in the way the writer gives expression to the story. That is the plot. Plot encompasses many techniques or methods that the writer is choosing, which is a kind of a violation of something regular that the writers in the past have been doing, like giving us the detail of an incident in a chronological order. Now, if the writer breaks the chronological order choosing any technique, either impressionism, flashback, or the reverie of or thoughts of a character, that would be the study of the plot and technique of the narration. Now that we have looked at the key concepts, which is the contribution of formalism to literary criticism, stylistics, and the critical theories of the study of language of literature, we have seen in detail how the understanding of literariness of language makes us familiar with the idea of defamiliarization, and also introduces us to the idea of automatization, and also to the idea of foregrounding. Similarly, in the study of prose and fiction for the formalists, plot and chose must be separated and must be studied separately if we are to arrive at the understanding of the techniques, forms, and methods employed by the prose and the fiction writers, and this would enhance our understanding of the style as well as the meanings of the works. Apart from these discoveries and contributions of the formalists, we realize that it is a short-lived movement that lasted for about 20 years. For example, starting from the 1900 and lasting till 1920. But it does not mean that it lost its impact. In fact, formalism was a breakthrough into the discovery of the understanding and analysis of the language of literature. With the help of the concepts that formalists proposed for the study of literature and criticism, further developments were also made by certain other schools, like in America, New Criticism, as we learned earlier too, developed the same concepts of formalism for the study of style of poetic and literary language. Then schools of criticism of literature like structuralism, post-structuralism, deconstruction have developed their ideas, and they have founded their understanding of the text, literature, and language on what has been proposed by the formalists. So formalists initiate the study of the language of literature as distinctive, unique, possessing literariness and defamiliarization and foregrounding. Certain leading figures of the 20th century, like Roland Barthes, Julia Kristeva, Frederick Jameson have been quite indebted to the developments by Roman Jakobson, Mikarowski for formalism. Now, this is the impact of formalism on stylistics as well as on other modes of literary criticism which are encompassed within stylistics. Because I've been telling you that stylistics is a very broad field. It takes into account the criticism, that is literary criticism theories, formalist theories, and the theories in the fields of feminism, in the fields of literary criticism, as well as critical discourse analysis. Now, we cannot divide or draw a line where stylistics influence and its genre or its expanse comes to an end, because the schools of thought that are to develop after formalism not only devise certain distinctive and separate fields and schools of criticism, but all these schools also strengthened the analysis that is done for the sake of stylistic analysis of the text. Now let us look at certain advantages or merits of the approach formalism. For we have discussed the point earlier also that formalism is a scientific approach. The formalist critics focus on the text from the perspective of language. Language, which is the evidence of anything that the linguist or the critic is imposing upon the text. Any meaning, any understanding, any interpretation that a linguist or a formalist draws or makes about a text would be solely based on the words, their meanings, their connotations, and the language. Outside that text, they would not look for its meaning. For example, the author's personality, time, society, history would not be taken into account. So that is why it becomes objective, scientific approach for the study of literature. It is also considered the merit or the advantage of formalism that it focused the attention of the critics on the re-evaluation of literary texts. It would be re-evaluation because certain new meanings or new dimensions of meaning and interpretations would be revealed to the critics when they study the text independently, considering it autonomous of the author, time, and place in which it was produced. So, when we place the study of the actual work at the center of the scholarship and all the other influences like biography of the author, his psychological bent of mind, his sociological leanings, and his philosophical thoughts are reduced to periphery or the border, then the text would give certain meanings which we had not reached to before. So it would be re-evaluation of the literary texts which have earlier been looked at from a very limited or from a very narrow perspective. Another merit or advantage of formalism is that it will lead to the awareness of resolving the difference or the dichotomy between content and form. Now these terms content and form are not new for you. As the students of stylistics, you are now pretty much aware that content is the material and message of a work, whereas the form is the device, the technique, and the style employed by the author. So the formalists resolve this dichotomy or this difference, that form and the message are separate, but they lead to the in-depth understanding of each other. For example, if we are studying the form, if we are studying the style or the devices of a work, we are in fact making an effort to understand the meaning, the message, the material. So, at the sake of ignoring the form, the meanings may not be holistic or comprehensive. So this dichotomy has been resolved by the formalist, that writing is given significance over its content. When we give importance to form and style, we are analyzing it, that how this style is considered to be suitable for the expression of a particular content or a message. So they define the dynamic relationship between material and device. Material is the message and content, and device is the form and style. So the form and the content, device and material, style and message are connected, but in order to reach the message, material and content, we must first understand and analyze the form, the devices and the style of the work. So formalists' attention to form, and they're insisting upon the fact that form would lead us to the message or meaning, is a kind of resolution that has been brought between the literary criticism that focused on the message and linguistics that focuses only on language. Another important development or contribution in the form of the advantage of formalism is that it brought to light the importance of rhyme, rhythm, meter, sound patterns in language, earlier which have just been considered to be the devices for the sake of creating melody to the ear. So the linguistic features of literary work are considered to be worth a technical examination. For that reason, the study of meter has been done. How does it play its role in conveying the messages in the poems? Another advantage of formalism is that it brought a shift into reading process. Now the reading process was earlier, as started from the point of view of a literary critic, was focused on the author, and then it was to examine the meanings of the text, what the author meant to exhibit and portray through his work. But now reader is given significance. Formalism demystifies the figure of the author, considering him or her secondary, and the work becomes primary thing. This results in the emergence of the reader as a participant in the understanding of the work. So reader adds meanings, or reader on his perceptions, understandings and knowledge and experiences adds meaning to the work when he reads it, rather than we find author's personality within the work. We should look at how we as a reader relate to the work. Now that is the breakthrough. That is a very great advantage of the new way of study of literature, because formalists are proposing that the writer's personality should be demystified. It should be relegated to the background, and the reader should appear more prominent and active in making meaning of the text through the study of the form and style of the work. And also a literary critic is giving meanings to work, despite the fact that the writer's personality might be evident, but we are not looking for the meanings which writer wants to present. We are looking at the meanings which we get without having any knowledge of the writer's time, personality, age, society or political background. Apart from these advantages that formalism has proposed for the study of literature, for the study of stylistics and for the study of style of language, certain critics also associate that formalism ignored a few aspects. And what are these aspects which formalism ignores? And these are known also as the demerits of the approach, or certain deficiencies that are inherent or embedded there in the formalism or the formalist school. They are like ignoring the author's intention. Many critics are of the view that ignoring the writer's personality, his time, age, his biography, his psychological, sociological, philosophical leanings would not lead us to the comprehensive analysis and understanding of a text. So, and on one hand, it is advantage that a new meaning of a text will be revealed. That is what the formalists propose, that they ignore author because they don't want to limit the meaning of the work to author's life and time. Whereas the opponents of formalism think that ignoring the author's time, personality and era would not lead us to reach to the accurate meanings or the meanings which are prominent in the context in which the work was produced. So the opponents take the same as the disadvantage of formalism. And the disadvantage that the opponents claim formalism carries is that formalists separate text from time and place. So not only demystifying the author, but also taking the work away from the time in which it is produced, from the place or region in which it is produced. We may not be able to understand what the work really conveys about the people of the time in which the author lived, in which the work was done. So the work had an immediate audience, according to the opponents of formalism. The work had an immediate audience and the message which is more suitable and closer to the people living in the time in which the work was produced. And when formalists take this work or study this work in isolation from the time and era and geography, they do not get to the meanings which were intended by the author for the immediate audience of the work in that time. So for the opponents, what is the strength of formalism becomes the weakness, as demystifying the author and ignoring the context of time and place. Then the opponents of formalism also consider it their demerit that they stress on objectivity, that formalists tend to be objective, scientific, and more, you can say, objective in their approach towards the analysis of literary works. Although it is difficult to ignore anything that is the production of the intrinsic emotional feelings and desires of an author, and it is the expression of the state of mind, what is impressing him, what is influencing him, and also it is something that is a kind of a message for the people, the time in which an author lives. Either it would be a political message or social or moral message inherent in the text for the very people. As we looked at the merits and also the demerits of formalism, the purpose of looking at these notions was to understand that what is that stylistics has given to the literary criticism and what formalism has contributed to stylistics. Because formalism is the major first or initial approach that has highlighted the significance of language or the study of language of texts. So that is why the approach is supposed to meet or receive the mixed reaction from the critics or the people. As in the last lecture also, I highlighted this fact that formalism received more criticism from Marxist theorists, because formalism focuses on form and it does not take into account the political, social, psychological, or biographical leanings of the author, because it is putting the text out of its context. The text is not to be looked at representation of a thought or ideology, because we see that every text, for example, a poem, might present itself to be something that is symbolic, and that is a symbolic commentary maybe on the corruption of the politicians or the anarchy in the state due to the upheaval or the corruption or the policies of the politicians, for example. It might be an account of maybe the condemnation of war or such acts that are atrocious. Maybe the literature written after the First World War or Second World War cannot be looked at in isolation from the time in which it was produced, because it has a stance, it has a message, it has an ideology, either condemning a particular country's policies or a particular government's policies, or even an indictment on the humanity at large. Look at Golding's work, for example. How can you study Golding's work as an allegory, that is the Lord of the Flies, if you do not know that the work or the novel is an indictment of the humanity suffering and its indifference towards the morals, that it is deteriorating due to the fact that it is killing itself through war and such atrocious acts. So it reveals the fact that one way of studying literature could be separating it from the author, time and place, that is the context of a work. But whether this is the only approach available for the analysts, or whether it should be the only way we should look at text, is to be decided by the critic itself, by the reader itself. Now we as the readers are approaching literature from the perspective of a stylistician, not just from the perspective of a formalist critic, because if we look at text as formalist critic, we will consider only those principles which the formalists follow. That is why stylistics encompasses all the approaches and developments, and one such major approach is formalism, that highlights the significance of style and form, and that gave way to many other critics, linguists and theorists to devise their methods, strategies and plan how can the text of literature be approached, what can be the dimensions, what can be the methods or modes through which it can be analyzed. Because earlier the literary critics' approach was not enough to perform a rigorous, stylized analysis of a text. Now that formalism has initiated the project of giving significance and importance to language, separating the work of the language or the art, that is literature, from time and author, it opens many avenues for other critics, and many other schools of criticism would emerge out of it. And one such school or method is stylistics, which would not take into account only one approach, for example formalism. It would be a more interdisciplinary and broader approach, which takes for its initial understanding of the text the theories and methods developed by the formalists. So that is why we studied the merits as well as the demerits of formalism, in order to know that what is it that stylistics has taken from formalism, and why stylistics only does not depend on formalism for its study. Because if formalists limit the analysis of a literary text, that is why stylistics takes those points or those ideas of formalism which can help in the understanding and comprehensive analysis of a text, whereas its disadvantage focus on the fact that there must be some other ways and modes which are to be discovered and developed for the understanding of style of literary works. So that is all for today's lecture. We will inshallah continue with a few examples of poems for the sake of understanding how stylistic analysis from formalist perspective can be employed on literary text, which would be the stylistic analysis of literature as text. Thank you.